Time preference. What is it? Why does it matter? And how is it connected to money? This is the topic of today's episode. Welcome. My name is Nikolai, and we are talking about this book, The Bitcoin Standard, the Decentralized Alternative to Central Banking, by Dr. Saifedean Ammous. He is an economics professor from Lebanon. And we are trying to understand the concepts of this book in order to understand the potential of Bitcoin. He doesn't actually talk a lot about Bitcoin in the first couple of chapters because he thinks that in order to understand why Bitcoin is actually very, very powerful in what it could achieve, we first need to understand how money works, how economics work, and especially how the current system is flawed. So the first couple of chapters, you will barely hear a word about Bitcoin, and that's exactly how I want to do this series as well, because I learned a lot and I just want to put that information out there so we don't have too many misunderstandings about what Bitcoin actually is and why a lot of people believe that eventually, maybe in a couple of years, this will really take off. One more thing to say before we get into the nitty-gritty. Today we are at a topic, time preference, where he said in a recent podcast that this is probably the favorite chapter of the book. So you can be very excited about the content of this episode because it is really something interesting. He starts the chapter on time preference by talking about the importance of sound money again, and he summarizes basically some important factors why the soundness of money is important. Because first of all, it protects value across time. Secondly, it allows for trade to be based on a stable unit of measurement, and therefore ever larger markets emerge and you can do economic calculation and planning. And sound money, and for those who just start this series today, sound money is a money that cannot in its supply be unlimitedly enlarged. So the supply is limited, it is scarce, therefore it is sound. Some other aspects come to it, but that's the major one. And the third reason sound money is very important is because it is required for individual freedom from despotism and repression, because in order to governments to have power, they only get that by being able to create money. So if you don't give them the power to create more money, inflation, then you will actually protect your individual freedom to a large degree. Today we add a very, very, very important concept to these other factors that I just listed, and that is the sound money incentivizes people to think long term. And he says, you can describe it in another way, you could just say it lowers their time preference. What does it mean? Well, think about it this way. There is a certain aspect about individual decision making that influences all decisions, whether we know it or not, and that is whether we prefer to have what we want right now, or whether we are able to wait a little and maybe get more of what we want in the future, but have to therefore delay gratification. So time preference, basically as he defines it, is the ratio at which an individual values the present compared to the future. Everyone values the present higher than the future because we are all going to die. So everybody has a certain feeling for how important the present is. But there are differences in the ratio at which how much you value the present over the future. And therefore, if you value the present over the future to a small degree, then you have a low time preference. You are willing to wait, you are willing to invest into the future because you say, well, the future is also good for something. If you have a high time preference, that means you value the present incredibly much, and therefore you say, who cares what in the future is? I want to live now. YOLO, you only live once. That's the difference between low time preference and high time preference. And Dr. Ammous says that the soundness of money has a huge impact on people's time preference. And time preference in itself is a process that initiates human civilization. The amount of time preference, or the ratio. So the lower the time preference is, the more people value the future over the present, the higher the process of civilization developing is. So why would anyone defer the receipt of goods and why would anyone delay that, right? Why would anyone say, well, if I can have that right now, why shouldn't I take it right now? Well, because oftentimes you can get larger quantities later if you wait a little, and we will dig into this. He says animals, basically, they have a very high time preference. They value the present very, very much over the future, and therefore they basically just live in the now. They have an instinctive living, and they do very little planning, very little preparing ahead of time. Some animals do that by, for example, building nests and stuff, but it's very small to compare what humans do. Lower time preference, says Dr. Ammous, allows us to curb our animalistic impulses. It allows us to act rationally, in a sense, because we realize, well, the present is not everything there is. And that enables our engagement in production of goods that will take longer to complete. So by lowering our time preference, we actually start producing goods that take longer to produce, but we are creating, therefore, goods which are useful for the production of further goods. I will give you an example in a second. So by lowering our time preference, we don't only create goods for immediate consumption. That's the whole point. We don't just live for now, feeding, eating, sleeping, hunting. We actually create goods for further production, which is a huge difference in society. And those goods are called capital goods. There are consumption goods, that's what you consume right now, and then there are capital goods. So let's think about, for example, developing tools for hunting, he says. Well, what's the easiest way? If you're hungry and you're a fisher, well, you go out and you try to get some fish. And that is what you would do if you have a high time preference and you're hungry. But if you understand the whole concept of fishing, maybe you will say, well, I'm going to need some fish in 10 days, in 20 days, in a year. So how about I develop some tools for hunting, and therefore I invest some of my time right now into producing something that could, in the future, give me more results. But, of course, it is connected with not having that amount of time for hunting right now. So a fisher who starts to produce a sophisticated fishing rod, he actually loses time at first because he can't use that time for fishing and eating, but he might get a lot more fish later. So he is able to delay his immediate gratification, and he invests into the future by producing a good, a capital good, with which he can then in the future produce more goods. And of course you can enlarge that. It's not only a fishing rod. Maybe somebody says, hey, we should start building a boat. We should be able to go out, and then we should throw down the nets into the sea, and oh no, we should make a bigger boat so we can put 2 nets and all that. But all that is connected with having to invest first, maybe like spending a year or 2 years building those boats, in order to then later have more possibility for results. Of course, that is always connected with a risk of failure, because it could not work out and then you wasted a year or 2 years of your life. But this is exactly what time preference is about. That if you value the future highly, then you will invest into that future, although there is a risk connected with that. He then references the very famous, maybe you've heard of it, experiment by Stanford professor Walter Mischel, I think Mischel. He was a psychologist, as much as I remember, in the 1960s, and he performed the famous Marshmallow Experiment. So basically he set little kids down in a room and said, hey, you know what, here's a marshmallow, you can have that right now. I'm going out of the room, I'm coming back in 15 minutes. Either you eat it right now or you wait 15 minutes, and when I come back, I'll give you another one. So what does he do? Well, he basically tests the time preference of these kids. How much do they value the present over the future? And it's interesting because there's a trade-off in it, right? You get more later if you wait. So some kids ate the marshmallows right away, other kids waited, got 2 later. And then the important thing is he did a research on these kids decades later, and there was a very high significance in relationship to how those kids that were able to delay their immediate gratification, who had a low time preference, how they were better academically, they had higher SAT scores, they had a lower body mass index, so they were thinner, and they had a significant lack of drug abuse. So very interesting how early on you can tell by this experiment that certain characteristics, personality traits lead to success later on. And then he writes something that I thought was a new concept for me in that regard, because he connected economics with time preference. And he says, if we think about economic decisions, we have to understand that economic decisions involve our future self. And we're basically, by deciding whether we're going to have something right now or later, we're constantly in a relationship with our future self, and we are trading with our future self. And I thought, of course, I knew that before, that we have a future self, and when we procrastinate or when we say, well, I just want to have it right now, we basically put all the burden on the future self because he has to handle it, then the problem that we cause today. But now he puts it in the relationship with economics, and he writes on page 77, the reality is that the most important economic decisions to any individual's well-being, and now what is it, are the ones they conduct in their trade-offs with their future self. So the most important economic decision is not whether you build a business or whether you save taxes or whether you save money. It is the most important economic decision is how you conduct your trade-offs with your future self. So time preference is a major category for understanding economics. You can, I think the truth of this example is if you look at certain persons who made a lot of money very quickly, for example, Mike Tyson, the boxer, and then you look how they handled that money and how they spend it, and Mike Tyson is broke now. He lost millions and millions of dollars because he wasn't able to think about the future more than he thought about the present. We all think about the present, but the question is, how much do we also think of the future? And therefore, he had very, very bad trade-offs with his future self, and his future self now is his present self and has to deal with the problem of not having money after having had hundreds of millions of dollars. What then determines the time preference of an individual? Well, there are different factors. Number one, first, basically, the general security of a people determines their time preference. If you are in a country that is in great war and you have people dying and all that, of course your time preference is going to be higher because you are very much concerned about just surviving. Yeah? The second one is the security of your property. If your property is where you're living, constantly in danger of being taken away or destroyed, of course you are going to have a higher time preference. If your property is absolutely secure and you know for hundreds of years this has always belonged to you or your family or the village has not been destroyed, that lowers your time preference. You are going to think more about the future. And then another one is that the tax rates actually influence your time preference, because if the tax rates are really high, you are going to save less, and because you're going to say, well, the money is going to be taken away from me, and that higher your time preference. But those are all side notes, those three. The number 4 is the most important for this book and also for understanding Bitcoin, and that is the expected future value of money influences directly our time preference. And when I heard that, that got me thinking. The expectation of how much is money going to be valued at in the future is directly linked to my time preference. I didn't know that, but then I reflected on it and I realized it's actually true. Because if the money is good at holding the value into the future, so if it doesn't lose value, if it actually appreciates in value, then that incentivizes people to delay consumption and to dedicate resources for production in the future. Because you realize, well, wait a minute, in the future this is going to be more valuable, so maybe I'm just going to delay some gratification, I'm actually going to have more. And this is exactly what happened a lot of times in history when the money was harder than it is now, that people saved more and that people actually invested a lot more in the future because they realized it's worth waiting for that consumption. And you can already hear the problem, like in the ear of Keynesian economics, like he describes it, that they say, well, then the whole economy is going to break down because nobody's consuming anymore. Well, that would only be the case if the present gets to a point where we don't value it at all anymore, which is never going to happen because we always have to eat and we always have to consume some goods in the present. So we will always consume, even if maybe we're in a deflationary economy, but we will just think a lot harder about what we consume. So in a podcast, he gives a great example. He says, well, think about your cell phone. You're going to pretty much know that in 10 years, your cell phone, your iPhone or whatever, is going to be worth a lot less. So why not wait another 10 years to buy that new iPhone then and to have a very, very valuable version and to not waste your money right now on a product that is going to be less valuable in the future? And he says, well, that's not how we do decisions. We actually want some right now because we live in the present, so we will consume, but we will think hard about it. He also says that lower time preference has an impact on morals. Future thinking is less like future thinkers who think of the futures are less likely to steal, to cheat, or to lie. Interesting, right? Because if people are aware of the consequence in the future, they will realize that cheating, lying, and stealing is actually going to destroy their own lives in the future. Lying, cheating, and stealing is always good for right now, not always, but it often helps right now. But in the future, you're always going to lose out by living that way. One huge problem with unsound money, as we have it right now, according to his definition, is that people are directing their energy toward producing monetary goods instead of productive labor. So because money is such a thing that can be increased in its supply right now, there are hundreds and thousands of people working for central banks and for planning and how should we do the interest rates for next half year and whatever. Thousands of people putting their energy into how they can manage the monetary good, which was never supposed to be the case. But what would be a lot better is if they put their labor into producing something productive for the future and not dealing with monetary goods that shouldn't be a job occupation in his regards. And that is, of course, again related to the time preference. A major factor where we can see the current situation about time preference, which is that we have a very high time preference compared to how it used to be in history. And he says it's connected to the money we have, to government money. Look at the part before this, and that's where I'm trying to explain that. One way we can see that very clearly is by the saving rates. Yeah? Because when do you save money? Well, only if you expect a increased return in the future. Only if you think, all right, I will get more in the future, you will start thinking about delaying gratification. And saving money is delaying gratification because you could have something great right now, I don't know, a new pair of shoes, and you would be happy right now. But if you think about saving that money and you realize, oh wow, I could actually buy 2 pairs of shoes in 5 years if I save that money, and you still have good shoes, assuming that, then you are actually incentivized to delay that gratification. But that only works if your money is appreciating in value. So today it's exactly the opposite. Because money is inflationary, we are constantly not incentivized to save, but incentivized to borrow. The interest rates are low, so we are incentivized to borrow money that we actually don't have and not save money. That means if you look at the saving rates, the average in 1970, so about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was 12.66% per person per year. 12.66% across the 7 largest economies. Today, or 2015, think about how much people save. It's 3.3%. So almost 3/4 drop in savings rate in only 50 years. And that is a clear sign of how the time preference changes. And time preference has a impact on a lot of factors. Compared to that, the savings rate are the debt rates. People nowadays, today, average more than 100% of annual income in debt. So not only people are saving less, but they are actually incredibly high into debt because the interest rates are so low, so you are incentivized to borrow, and therefore you are living in debt. I don't think that's a good development, but it only is curable if we know about how it came about, because people are always incentivized to do something. And one way you incentivize people to delay gratification is by telling them or giving them a medium of exchange that is actually good at holding its value. And you can probably think about that Bitcoin might come into this handy because it is a medium of exchange, a store of value that is very much restricted in its ability to increase in size, and therefore it gives people an incentive to save for the future because they realize, well, this is actually going to appreciate in value, so I'm not going to spend it all right now. And this is exactly the point where we're not yet at. A lot of people still speculate with Bitcoin because, in my opinion, they have not understood what it is really about, and therefore we are not at the point where people realize what Bitcoin really is. And therefore we're in a bear market. That's my explanation. I think it might take 1 year, 2 years, I don't know how long. I think the price is going to go down a lot further. That's just my opinion. Because I think exactly what I just said, people don't realize what value Bitcoin actually has in being able to hold value over the future, because it will not be able to increase in supply. And I think most people haven't realized that, and therefore they're just speculating whatever. And yeah, but that's just a side note. So I have talked about Keynes already a little bit, and he does too, because Keynes is a very, very the economist, the British guy. He actually never studied economy, but he had a huge impact after the Second World War. Please watch the part before in order to understand that impact. He basically vilified saving, and he did that strategically. He said lending should not be restricted only to investments for the future, but we could also lend out money for consumption. That is how all credit cards and all that started developing. So now we have a system where you not only lend money, which is oftentimes bad because you could just save money and wait a little, but we have actually people borrowing money for immediate consumption. So they buy a TV with a credit card, although they don't have the money. And that all goes back, according to Dr. Saifedean Ammous, to a Keynesian view of economics, where it's proposed that you have to spend money in order to keep the economy running, and the more money you spend, the better. Therefore, let's incentivize people to borrow money and save less. And of course, we can do that by inflating, by being able to inflate money. He said something that I wasn't aware, because capitalism always is connected to that depth and also to an understanding of being irresponsible and reckless with the consumption of good. But he says, well, the definition of capitalism is exactly the opposite. The definition of capitalism, according to him, is it's an economic system based on capital accumulation from saving. So it's a system which grows through people saving money. And because they save money more and more and more goods for future production of goods accumulate, and therefore society has new possibilities to advance, basically. That is his definition of capitalism. I thought that's interesting that it's directly connected to saving, which we are not really used to seeing it that way. By the way, Keynes lived not by working a known job, but he lived from a very rich family and the fortunes of this rich family, which is interesting that he never had to work for his money. He never had to save money. He had a rich family and he could just use up all their wealth. And he is the one who proposed we need to spend more in order to have a better economy. Economic growth, according to Dr. Ammous, is only able through delayed gratification. And by the system we currently have, watching the one part before that, we have a nationalized system of money, and that means that short-term horizons are in play because politicians are looking for re-election, and that is always in Germany, it's every 4 years. So basically, you're not going to be incentivized to think long-term because you're incentivized to get re-elected, and because you have the power over money right now as government, you will not try to change that into a thing that might be first for people unpopular, saying, well, we are actually going to increase interest rates because then they can't borrow that much anymore. He also connects the time preference aspect to a moral aspect that we haven't discussed. He said, if you have unsound money like we do right now, the government assumes more and more power because they are in the position of creating money. And that also destroys family structures, because now the government is in a position where they are more and more in the position of a family member by having unsound money allows the state to appropriate essential roles like supplying protection, supplying if somebody's doing bad, they're going to give them some money, all that. And that used to be with the family. And the government only got that power because of being able to create more money. Two more important aspects about time preference that I thought were fascinating is, of course, time preference connected to sound money is also directly connected to innovations. So in the time of the gold standard, let me just see if I have everything. Yes, I do. In the time of the gold standard, there were a lot of innovations. And he makes a very interesting distinction. There are innovations that go from 0 to 1. And then there are innovations that go from 1 to many. So 0 to 1 inventions are inventing something that hasn't been there before. Creatio ex nihilo. So basically you have not been able to fly before, and now all of a sudden you can actually fly. That's a 0 to 1 invention. A 1 to many invention is improving on flying and innovating a new motor, innovating a new wing, innovating whatever, right? But that is all building on that first innovation. And he says that the impact of sound money on time preference can be seen in the level of savings, and it can be seen in the type of projects in which a society invests. Because, of course, if you want innovations, it only comes about if people are willing to invest in future projects. And that they will only do that if they have a low time preference. Now, what is interesting is that he says the number of innovations per capita, per person, actually peaked not today or 50 years ago, but in the 19th century. So we haven't really seen a lot of innovations since then, and we especially haven't really seen a lot of innovations from 0 to 1. He says our modern world is basically invented in the gold standard years. So everything we have today, well, we refined it, we improved it, we economized it, but the real invention comes from a time where people had a lower time preference and were willing to invest into long-term projects and therefore invented very, very impactful things. So he lists some of these things and it's just impressive. I wasn't aware of the number of inventions that happened in the 19th century and how they are basically contributing to everything we know as our modern world. So, hot and cold running water, indoor toilets, plumbing, central heating. Wow. Electricity, internal combustion engine, then the automobile, airplane, city subway, electric elevator. All inventions 0 to 1, not one to many. Heart surgery, organ transplant, radiation therapy, anesthetics, petroleum-derived chemicals like plastic and all that, stainless steel, of course telephone, wireless telegraphy, voice recording, color photography, movies, and so on and so on. So there was actually a lot going on that time, and it's interesting to see it connected to low time preference and low time preference being connected to the soundness of money. And the last aspect of time preference that he lists is how it is connected to artistic flourishing. During those years of the gold standard, he says that we had an artistic flourishing that was very different from today because the people who produced artworks that took years and years and years to produce. But not only that, you first had to invest years and years and years in order to get that good in your craft. So it was a huge investment into the future. And therefore you had works from Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. You had artists like Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. You had things that we still have hundreds of years later. And it was possible because people were willing to delay gratification for future projects. And not only that, but they had also people who paid for that, which wasn't the government, but it was so-called Patreons that financed these people. And of course, these Patreons only had that money because they were able to save in a time where the soundness of money was guaranteed, at least to a bigger degree than it is today. And he compares that, Dr. Ammous, to our artistic situation today. And let me tell you, if you want to read that chapter, I can just summarize this. He is not abused about the current state of modern art. He doesn't think it's art. He doesn't think it takes a lot of time to do it. He doesn't think it takes a lot of time for someone to get the skills to do it. And music, the same thing. So he says we can see like a decline in the artistic value of the things being produced, and he connects that to time preference and to sound money. So you can see it's a very wide vision. This is it. I hope you enjoyed this episode about time preference, about the hardness of money, how it's all connected, and I hope you can also see some aspects of those things being relevant to your everyday decision making. I hope you have a good day, and if you like this video, please share it with some others. I would love to have some conversation. I would love to read some comments and listen to what you think. And of course, we are getting closer and closer to actually talking about Bitcoin. Have a great day.